Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Indiana Nomad Podcast, sponsored by DataShapes, the experts in all things signal and waveform AI. I am your host, Logan Selby. This podcast will introduce various experts from different industries from around the globe to give their thoughts on technology and how it has affected them personally and professionally. We will spend time understanding how innovation is changing their industry and where each guest sees the evolution going in their respective field. I hope you enjoy and feel free to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or our YouTube channel at Indiana Nomad. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Indiana Nomad Podcast. Today is the second episode that myself and Junaid Islam is doing on a mini-series about Zero Trust Decentralized AI. Today, we're welcomed with two new guests, Mr. Randy Clark and Mr. Glenn Haddix. What I'm going to do now is you've met Junaid on the last episode, so if you want to know a little bit more about Junaid, feel free to tune in to episode 1 of this mini-series. But in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over to Randy to give a little bit of his background. So Randy, take it away.
Great. Well, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Randy Clark. I'm a Marine Corps communicator, no longer serving on active duty. That was well over 25, 30 years ago. I spent my career in telecommunications, working for Tier 1 carriers. I've also had the opportunity to be the vice chair of the National Spectrum Consortium and do CETA contracting work for the Department of Defense around disruptive wireless technologies.
Great. Well, thanks for being here, Randy. Glenn?
Yeah, I'm Glenn Haddix. I learned the cyber game when they used to call it naval intelligence. I've worked for defense for many, many years, and then the last 9 years, I worked for one of the largest utility companies as their CISO.
Great. Well, thanks for being here. So kind of setting the stage, our last episode, Junaid and I spoke about Zero Trust Decentralized AI and the different domains that is applicable, which is pretty much across the board. One we wanted to focus on today, and we wanted to welcome these gentlemen on the podcast, was to talk about smart energy and utilities. So I'm going to turn it over initially to Randy to kind of further set the stage and get into some of the details that we wanted to discuss today. So Randy, take it away.
Yeah, Roger. So what I want to bring up is the concept of blackout manufacturing. So one of the observations I've had over the years is that in manufacturing, very much like smart city or smart base operations, there are three critical pillars to IoT and OT. One being resilient energy source, because without energy, you can't power the communication and networking technologies for industrial IoT and operational technologies. Secondly, you need some kind of localized switching. So if you get disconnected from the grid and you get disconnected from telecommunication services, you can switch locally, provision locally. And then thirdly, you need a very robust cybersecurity posture so you can operate under a cyber attack. So to reiterate, right, power resiliency, telco isolation, and zero trust are three of the pillars to blackout manufacturing. They're the same pillars to tactical communications. They're the same pillars to a smart base or to a smart city. So the DoD currently is going through network modernization, base modernization. Today, they're more reliant on power than they ever have been. And if we look at the trends within Industry 4.0 in the digital economy, automation of processes are only going to get greater. So the reliance on power to operate this infrastructure reliably becomes absolutely critical in nature. So generator backup may not be good enough. Fuel cell may not be good enough. We really have to look to sustainable, renewable energy sources that are local, that give us indefinite power, even in a degraded comms environment.
Great. I appreciate that. We brought Glenn on, so we'd love to hear your thoughts too in response to Randy's opening statement. So, what do you have to say, Glenn?
Well, yeah, so DoD has been working with utilities over the last few years to get the utility companies to be more responsible for the power going into the base, helping them make sure they're cyber safe on their OT side. A couple of challenges to this is one, the regulatory side. the base has certain requirements no other manufacturers have, and the utilities don't have a tariff for it. So it makes it a challenge with their local um, regulatory bodies from each state. The other thing is liability. The utilities don't want to take on the liability of all the equipment on a base. So these are some key points that need to be worked out. The technology is definitely there to do it. There just needs to be more communication on how the steps need to be done. And the problem is the base, when everybody's at the base, they have people to do the work. When most of the base deploys and only the command element is left, the workers are all gone on deployment. So they don't have a steady workforce. So that's another challenge to all of this.
So Glenn, since you're an expert in energy, as you've seen, both from the leadership in the Pentagon as well as on the civilian side, there's a big interest in green technologies, specifically wind and solar. Do you have any comments or thoughts about attaching or integrating those kind of technologies into the existing grid, and what policymakers on the civilian side and military leaders need to think about before they start implementing this on a large scale?
Yeah, so let's talk about the basics of it first on green. If you're talking about solar, solar works during the day, and if you don't consume the power, then you have to put it in a battery. And there's a lot of physics to energy lose. So the best thing to do with the solar is consume it while it's being generated. The only issue with that is if you don't have solar at night, you've got batteries, or you have to have another source of energy, nuclear, traditional spinning mass, something of that nature. One of the things, we'll take California as an example. They want to electrify the state, but one of the things that hold back people from wanting to electrify is in the middle of the summer, the utilities have to put out a warning, hey, you can't charge your car because we don't have enough energy. And they're decommissioning nuclear sites in California. It's going to make it a real challenge for them to get the whole benefit of green energy. One of the things they may want to look at is the new nuclear cells that DOE made and put them on Indian reservation land outside of the state. They use lots of coal there, it would provide jobs, and then it would really allow green energy to shine because you could use nuclear at night to power at night, so you don't have dependency on battery technology. And you could use all the green energy you could produce to take care of electrification of the state. Same scenario works for microgrids that DoD sets up on bases or on deployments.
So, one of the things you've just introduced is this concept of, let's just call it smart energy. We need a different word, where you're actually bringing in the notion of solar combined with small form factor nuclear, but as a way to improve the balance. But we still need to balance the energy those systems are generating with the legacy systems, with the users. And now we're talking about civilian and military, where we have old air conditioners and new air conditioners, right? And the old ones you can't do much, and the new ones are smart. There seems to be an energy management issue that's going to get bigger and bigger as we do more of this, in addition to the regulatory. So I think you've touched on the regulatory frame issues, which I think are going to be difficult for us to talk about on this call, because that seems like a big topic on itself. But can you talk a little bit about the challenges about the requirement to manage all of this in real time, in terms of these new energy sources and old going into what would be a mixed grid, right? With old and new equipment on the distribution side.
Yeah, so let's talk about the grid kind of like the telecom 20 years ago, right? Where it used to be the power providers made all the energy and they provided energy out. It was a dogleg from production to consumer. Now you have consumers who are also consumers and producers. And you have places like solar panels on top of schools and school parking lots. So now you have a lot of cyber penetrations, right? And so you've got to be careful about that third party produced energy that, let's face it, how many windmills have you gone to that has the 4-foot fence, the old pickup outside and the gate open? Not the best security you ever look for, right? If we're going to utilize it, we've got to really integrate it. And one of the ways to really integrate it is to know what you can depend on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the issue now. If the wind stops blowing, the windmill guys can't do anything about it. So you can't yell at them, there's no wind. And if it's a rainy day, you can't do much on the solar side. So you got to have a nice balance of energy to draw upon so you can maximize what you get. I think that's one of the shortcomings you see for like a smart city and the government's done is they don't look at this as a totality. They try to regulate each component independently, and they're not looking at this as a holistic problem. And I believe if they did, they'd help the cyber part a lot.
Yeah, actually, now that you use word cyber, can you make any comments or do you have any thoughts about the level of cybersecurity or not? Because certainly it's very hard for me to gauge the level of integration of security. And I would think that these systems, and to Randy's point, as when he was talking about black hat manufacturing, if anything, they seem more vulnerable to cyber attacks than before because some of the older systems are so old, they're not connected to anything. And now we're moving to a hyper connected energy system. And one thing we've learned just over the last 2 decades is as America becomes more connected, it becomes more vulnerable to foreign enemies who now don't have to leave their country to attack the United States.
Oh, yeah. So let's be realistic. The U.S. grid is a target of every military of the world. And a perfect example is if China wanted to take over Taiwan and Seventh Fleet was standing in front of them, they may exercise something on one of the grids, one of the grid providers, and say, do you want me to black out the West Coast of the United States or the East Coast of the United States? And it will be used in diplomacy. So it is what it is. And one of the grid problems is you could have something you install today next to something that's 60 years old. And the grid used to run strictly on analog switches.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't buy those switches anymore. All the manufacturers have switched to digital. An analog switch, it's really hard to cyber attack. A digital switch, it's really easy to attack. So as you open up the grid to third-party providers and you digitize the grid, you make it naturally much easier to attack by a nation state. And they spend billions of dollars to figure out how to do this. And they are very worthy adversaries. The utilities have done a great job so far, but it is hard to think that a utility is going to stand off an army. They're not really set up to do that. And, data sharing's getting better, but it's not good enough yet. And so we continue to walk this fine line as we want to drive everything to digital, get more out of the green side of the house. But we're not really thinking about Mrs. Jones wants her electric bill to be as low as possible. She doesn't want you to go replace all the stuff in the grid because she don't want to pay an electric bill 5 times as much, right? So it isn't like normal industry that every 18 months they can refresh themselves. You have to consider that when you move forward in a grid because cyber is part of the business solution. It's just not cyber for the sake of cyber. So there's a balance. And DoD has the same problem. Medical, they make x-ray machines that can never take an OS upgrade. How do you integrate that stuff? That all the major critical industries have the same problem. Integration of data smartly and the moving of that data around is a real challenge. I think data shaping and artificial intelligence could be a great help in simplifying that problem.
So I want to put kind of Randy on the spot. So Randy, you spent a lot of time meeting policymakers at the Pentagon. What do you, given what Glenn has been talking about, what's your thought on this, the desire, which is very high in the U.S. government, versus the state of readiness? And then more importantly, how would we close that gap? Because listening to Glenn talk, I think the thing that comes to my mind is the goal that everybody seeks is, clean energy across the United States to support mission critical systems. But we're seeing now a lot of technical issues, cyber issues, regulatory issues. So do you have any thoughts about how to close that gap?
Well, I think we've touched on a lot of the important issues. Being able to protect legacy switches and sensors on in the infrastructure is important, so we can drive additional efficiency and reduce the cyber vulnerability of the legacy. We have to figure out how to create an eloquent marketplace for the exchange of data, or exchange of energy, which ultimately is the data that goes along with it. Glenn talked about the grid being two ways. Now it's just not a one-way pipe. It's absolutely essential to the health, wealth, and well-being of the U.S. economy, because the U.S. economy is being driven towards automation. It's only going to get more connected, whether it's wireless or wireline. And we have to do everything we can to create a strong economy, because a strong economy is the best national defense. So starting with, infrastructure that is designated by the Department of Homeland Security, critical infrastructure sector, that's energy, that's transportation, health and human services, it's nuclear regulatory, it's public safety, financial. We have to construct a reference architecture that's much more resilient and reliable. And I think that, finding ways to create spectrum agility, finding ways to leverage new technologies and software to find radio and cognitive radio, finding ways to do distributed AI at the edge so we don't have to use backhaul and we can get immediate insights that create valuable information that can be monetized. I think that's part of the new digital economy. And then, of course, the glue logic to all of that is the ability to protect the data, not necessarily the network, because data needs to be shared in order to increase its value. So data portability, data sovereignty, data governance are all key capabilities that need to be implemented so we can share data between disparate systems to create these new data insights while protecting the integrity of the data as it's consumed by artificial intelligence algorithms, right? So we can avoid data poisoning.
Great. So Junaid, do you want to try to, I guess, bring all this together? Obviously, Randy's throwing a lot of buzzwords out there that are very intimate and familiar to us. But as far as our architecture goes, the Zero Trust Decentralized AI, how does that play in? How do you see that causing a big impact in these various issues that we're kind of discussing?
So I think the thing that really comes to mind listening to Randy and Glenn talk is, I think obviously zero trust security, specifically the data, and decentralized AI are going to be really big enablers of the solution. The thing, though, in both of these gentlemen speaking, is that this is a multi-stakeholder dialogue, and it's multi-stakeholder in terms of the leadership in Washington, which is both on the civilian side and on the military side. but then it's a full matrix. It's a public-private partnership because the number of equipment vendors involved is literally in the thousands. I think about people putting temperature sensors on apartment buildings, and then those same temperature sensors show up on a military base, right? And then those sensors are going to transmit data which we want to secure so that people can't hijack it. But then it's going to go into a decentralized AI architecture that's going to look at the apartment building and figure out the optimal use of what's going on with the residents. But this is also happening on a military base. So I think the thing that we have to work out as a broader community is kind of enabling this multi-stakeholder dialogue. And I think it is possible. I mean, we're not going to say it's not done, but I think the challenge, this listening to Glenn, something at this scale has never been done in the U.S. government, period, or the Department of Defense, period. I mean, certainly the Department of Defense has done very impressive things by themselves, whether if you think about a nuclear submarine, it's actually a lot of work. It's everything, or an aircraft carrier, or if you think about the Air Force does in terms of launching satellites. I mean, it's just this huge amount of work, or Army does in logistics. On the civilian side, if you think about, as Glenn kind of mentioned, the amount of work that's gone into the energy grid by DOE over the last few decades has been massive, and they've certainly invested R&D dollars with partners on small form factor nukes, which is very impressive. And I agree with Glenn. Small form factor nukes could be a game changer in the United States. Giving us that consistent power we need. The tricky part, and I think as an enabler, I think we want security to be integrated in, because one thing we've learned about cyber attacks, you cannot make a system secure after it's deployed. It is just impossible because the software is already finished. And certainly from a management perspective, the ability to monitor these systems at the edge is going to be critical from a management perspective, because as we make everything smart, the amount of information being generated per day is going to be in the exabytes, and just in terms of what are cars doing, what are air conditioners doing, what's your stove doing, right? I mean, this all has to be captured and then reflected back. So I think, if you didn't know what you wanted to do and you took a clean sheet approach, you would have to go to a decentralized AI approach because you're not going to backcall. And then you'd also want to make it secure, which would mean that you'd want a zero trust embedded in. So I think certainly, one thing we can offer policymakers is, I think we certainly have some of the core components, but I think what would really have to happen at the Department of Defense and the DOE is we'd have to make some big decisions about things like software APIs to just allow information sharing. That does not exist today. All of the energy vendors, and I mean everybody, the air conditioners, the big power plants, they're all using their own software stacks and APIs and own message formats, which makes it very difficult to even capture that data. So I would hope that we do three big things. One, come together as a stakeholder community and just agree to share data. I think what Glenn said is kind of important. He said information sharing has started, but I think it really has to go to the next level. That is, we have to be open up. How are we going to see inside of a home securely, right? How are we going to see inside of a base securely? Because we need to see what's going on in the base to do that energy management, but we can't make the base vulnerable to a foreign cyber attack just because we've connected the power grid, right? So that is going to be a big step. One, just by itself, just basic monitoring. Then the second part is the real-time analysis. How are we going to capture that data? And then day one, the feedback might be static or offline, which is, dear energy manager, this is what the AI is thinking about. But that alone is a big phase two. And then phase three would be the kind of real-time management of energy sources and users, which, if I was to break that three-phase roadmap, probably at the fastest, it would be a decade, but I'll ask Glenn. It might take 20 years, right? But I do think if we worked together as a community, that is possible. I don't know if Randy, if you have some thought, or Glenn, about a kind of multi-stakeholder discussion, if it's possible or not.
Yeah, well, I think that the building blocks are there. I think assembling the right subject matter experts, the right companies with the right technology. I think there's a lot of opportunities to do realistic field trials that are scalable. So we have so we can build the reference architecture, put everyone on the same sheet of music. I also believe that this reference architecture that we're talking about for critical communications with zero trust, distributed AI at the edge, is scalable to tactical instances, right? And so we've got a dual use environment where we can monetize it commercially, but we can also impact the readiness and the lethality and the survivability of the warfighter at the edge.
Yeah, so Randy, of course, I'm always going to be a little more practical than you. You're always a couple of centuries ahead of me. I think some of the things we need to look at is figure out liability, right? Because as you tie this stuff together, do I take on liability if I'm attacked and your system is damaged? The U.S. laws, the U.S. Congress have not dealt with that. It's very unclear. I think that really holds people back from stepping in 100% because the footing's not very firm. So that would be very helpful. Two is we've got to understand that this is not a static problem. This is a moving problem. So we're in a catch-up game. So if we think we're going to catch up to where we're at today, when we get there, we're still behind again. So we've got to change our thought on the infrastructure side for a leap ahead of where things are going. So we're ready, and then we can stay in unison. The grid is an amazing thing, but it was built for keeping Mrs. Jones' electric bill down, and integration to the grid is difficult when you have a lot of very old pieces of equipment and local regulators who want to keep energy costs down. So we need to figure out who's going to pay for these innovations of the security to the grid. Should the local electric client be responsible for it? It's a national issue. That's an important part, especially when you're talking about supporting the bases. But two, it's the practical thing. What's the plus one that we're missing? There are whole kinds of industries that we could create if we did this. And I don't think people have sat down and figured out what that argument is. I think the economic benefit is so great. And if we had a clearer vision of what we wanted, I think you'd get a lot more people on board.
Actually, that's a great point. And, the jobs creation, the ability to create a secure supply chain in America to supply these, smart energy systems, I think is important. And I think Glenn is kind of correct. I think if we were to call an architectural meeting, I don't think anybody would show up. But I think if we called a meeting that said, there's going to be opportunities for new jobs in factories because there's going to be big purchasing, we'd probably get a much bigger crowd. So, I think what Glenn has said is kind of important. It could be the packaging of this that enables the multi-stakeholder dialogue. But, like I said, I mean, I've been to enough standards meetings in my career, and they're pretty boring. So we're not going to do that.
Well, gentlemen, great conversation. I know we're running up on the 30-minute mark, so I don't know if anybody has any final comments, but we can go around the horn to kind of close it out. So, Randy, any final words before we close out?
I just want to reiterate, the premise, right? Blackout manufacturing requires power resiliency in the event that you do lose connectivity to the grid, localized switching in case you do lose connectivity to the internet or the cloud, and that cyber resiliency, not necessarily at the network layer, but at the data layer, because you have to share data off-prem in order to increase its value to other stakeholders in the ecosystem, and localized compute, right? So you can generate those data insights, so you can act on them immediately, and then you only forward the true insights back to the cloud or to the data center, not all of the data used to create the insight, which would save in a lot of efficiencies in backhaul and
Sure.
in time.
Sure. No, perfect. Thanks for that. Glenn, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think people ought to be aware as we go and do more of this integration and upgrade, we're creating so much more data than we've ever created before. And how do we handle all of it? One of the things that I used to love to tell people as they went to digitize their data, if you build a really great engine, but you feed it cheap gas, you get poor performance. And I think some of what we need to do is make sure we're talking about the same thing. Data standardizations would make a lot of these things simpler, faster, and more secure.
Great. No, perfect. Thanks, Glenn. And couldn't agree more. Junaid, do you want to close it out for us?
Yeah, I just actually want to build on Glenn's point about standardization. I think one of the things the leadership at the Pentagon and then the leadership on the civilian side, DOE and Congress, need to look at is exactly what Glenn just mentioned. We probably need an open source architecture with the correct API hooks that allow people to publish data, stream data from sensors and imaging devices to AI systems where a zero trust system could lock it down. I think if we that should be relatively simple to do, but it'll make sure that people don't sue each other or don't feel they're going to be sued just for capturing the data. Beyond that, I think one of the things we are going to need is, somebody. It could be DoD, it could be DOE, it could be congressional initiative. Someone needs to step up in a leadership role and start kicking off these multi-stakeholder meetings. I think the good news, from this call. Certainly from a technical perspective, the technology's there. Certainly from a security perspective, we've learned a lot. From an AI perspective, we know what we want to do. And then as Glenn just mentioned, from a jobs perspective, this is all going to be exciting new jobs that young people will want and Congress will want to fund because these are jobs across America. So the good news is, we covered a lot of difficult topics, but the good news is there's definitely all the pieces. And I think what we're now looking for is someone at the DoD or DOE or Congress to take up a leadership position. Leadership opportunities are available.
Great. Well, thanks for that. And any listeners out there that are interested in learning more about Zero Trust, Decentralized AI, Junaid and I's concept and how we're working together, feel free to reach out. Like I said, this is the second iteration of a mini series that we're doing. This one was focused on smart energy and utility, but we'll be doing more in the future. But if anybody has any suggestions, feel free to reach out. Happy to cover a topic. But thanks, gentlemen. Thanks for being on the podcast today, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you.